Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. So I hope somebody can change between the slides for me. I'll try to make this as quickly as possible. My name is Dr. Michael Wולפוביץ. I'm a senior lecturer, Institute of Criminology, Faculty of Law at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. For the last 10 years, I've been studying, researching quantitatively terrorism, violent extremism, radicalization, ideologically motivated crime, to use the terminology of Yesh Din. My research has been funded by the Department of Homeland Security, Swedish Contingencies Agency of the European Union. I've served on various panels and advisory boards for their counter-violent extremism policy for these organizations. Before the war, I did a study on settler violence. I was mainly interested to see the relationship between what the between the administrative orders and Palestinian terrorism and settler violence. So in doing so, I got the statistics from the United Nations, from the OCHA, which were actually just mentioned just now. If you go to the next slide, please, we can see the statistics from the United Nations. Next slide, please. Okay, so here we have in the blue line is the United Nations statistics that were just mentioned on a monthly basis. The red line is the Palestinian Authority statistics. They overlap because the UN gets most of their statistics, well, one of their main sources, they have other sources, from the Palestinian Authority. The UN has slightly smaller numbers than the Palestinian Authority, 62 events per month on average from 2006 to 2023. What are these events made up of settler violence? Well, if you go to the next slide, you'll see there you go. So they have various categories in the data, including trespass and property damage. No, go back one slide, please. You skipped a slide. The green line at the bottom of the previous slide is the interpersonal violence. And instead of 62 events per month, we have an average of 9.77 events per month, which is 15% of all of the events recorded in the United Nations data. If you go to the next slide, please, you can see that up until 2019, in the United Nations reports, this is a screenshot from the 2019 report, they also broke things down by category. They no longer do that. So my 9.77 that I've calculated, you can see here, would be equivalent to the orange, except that I'm talking 2006 to 2023, would be equivalent to the orange, the monthly events per month. So they used the same categories that I've now used in my research as well. If we go into the next slide, please, into this interpersonal violence category, 9.77 events per month instead of 60-something, we see that there's four main issues in this data set. We've got issues of misrepresentation, double coding, issues with the motivation described in the description of the events, and misappropriation. I could give lots of examples for different ones of these. For miscategorization, we have events that would normally be classified by the UN as trespassing. They've just been miscategorized, and I've used examples, for example, going up to the Temple Mount. In 90-something% of cases, it's a trespass, but sometimes they accidentally...
Just a second. What do you mean by going to the Temple Mount? What does it... Please explain.
Every single day that there are Jews or sometimes even foreign tourists that access the Temple Mount, that is recorded in the UN data set as an act of settler violence under the category of trespass. So sometimes it's miscategorized as interpersonal violence, as in these few.
So every time someone goes on the Temple Mount, they count it as a violent act.
Correct.
Wow.
Correct.
Okay.
When they wake up in the morning, it's okay.
Unless they go back the next day.
Unless they wake up on the Temple Mount.
If I could just continue, I could give many examples. There's some pretty crazy examples. No, please go back to that slide we were on. Here's a picture from April 8th, 2018. A terrorist by the name of Mohammed Abed al-Karim stabbed some Jews at the entrance to Ma'ale Adumim. A private citizen with a licensed firearm neutralized the terrorist. This was recorded as an act of settler violence using firearms. The next day, the terrorist died of his injuries in hospital, and that was recorded again as an act of settler violence. So not only is it misappropriation, it's also an act of double counting. So, I could go on and on. But
we have with us the mayor of Ma'ale Adumim. If you're right,
Yair.
So the mayor of Ma'ale Adumim, if you neutralize a terrorist,
take the mic.
That's an act of settler violence. אם מנטרלים מחבל במעלה אדומים, זה מה שהוא אמר כרגע, שהנטרול של הטרוריסט שתקף במעלה אדומים, זה נחשב אלימות מתנחלים אצלכם. טוב, אז בסדר, אני לא רוצה שתפליל את עצמך.
לא, למה? הפוך. אני חושב מאחר ואני פשוט, יצא לי פה חבר הכנסת כסיף, אני עדיין
לא נורא, גם גלעד עכשיו הולך. גלעד, בוא תישאר איתנו.
גלעד פה, הוא רק הלך לדבר עם מישהו. יש אישור. אצלנו לא מגנים אנשים שהולכים לשירותים. אנחנו נאשר לך בלי הצבעה, בהסכמה כוללת. קונצנזוס.
אולי שלא יספרו את זה כאירוע אלימות.
תיזהר שאל תעבור בדרך בהר הבית, גלעד.
אני אגיד יותר מזה, שהאירוע הזה היה יכול להסתיים אחרת, אם המאבטחים גם לא היו חוששים לא להשתמש ברגע שהמחבל נוטרל בנשק שלהם, ולקרוא לזה אלימות מתנחלים זה פשוט בושה וחרפה.
Please continue.
Okay, I'm gonna try to just go through this quickly, just very quickly. We've also got incidents from West Jerusalem, which even according to the UN, they're not settlers. And in that case, if you even just remove only those incidents, which are an average of 15 per year, your monthly average of settler violence goes down already to 8. I would assume statistically we're probably looking at similar numbers per category, in which case we're probably looking at an average about 5 events per month on average. If you go to the next slide, please. I wanted to speak very quickly about counter-violent extremism. This is a term that we are not familiar with in Israel, but every Western country, the European Union, the United States, they all have CVE policies and strategies. And I've merited that much of my work on risk and protective factors, big meta-analysis I conducted, has provided the basis for a lot of their policies. In there, according to these policies, damages or weak socioeconomic capacity of individuals is a key risk and protective factor. We see this, by the way, in their policies vis-a-vis the Palestinians, where they're trying to increase their socioeconomic standing. So damages to socioeconomic capacity, in particular sudden changes, are a big risk factor. So they're taking the people that they've claimed are at the highest risk of offending, and then they're damaging their socioeconomic capacity, which according to their own models, which I'm not saying are correct, by the way, but according to their own models, are actually going to increase the risk. The sanctions, so the sanctions are antithetical to their own policies. The sanctions have never been applied in such a setting before against individuals in this way, and they've never been assessed for their impacts. This is really important because the CVE policies of the Department of Homeland Security, which I helped work on, talk about policies that are discriminate and disproportionate as leading to a backlash effect, and therefore CVE policies must be measurable. And that's exactly what I've done on the next slide. I've measured the sanctions, their impact on settler violence using the United Nations data. If we go to the next slide quickly, we'll see that the black dots are settler violence, the white dots are my control group, my quasi-experimental control group, which are Palestinian terrorism. And so we see here two things, that in October, we see this little spike. I could explain that away very easily. But then from November onwards, settler violence drops off considerably back to the lowest levels it's been in a very long time, already from November, December, January, February 1st, the sanctions come in, boom, it goes up again. What doesn't happen is that Palestinian terrorism doesn't go up. That means that the Palestinian terrorism is actually also not a response to settler violence. And it also shows that the sanctions are having a backlash effect, iatrogenic effects, as we would call it in scientific language. If we go to the next slide, and I'll finish up very quickly, the sanctions also come to say something else. Not only is the issue of settler violence getting out of control, but the Israeli response to it is inadequate and it's biased. And based on the Yeshdin report, which was mentioned just before by a member of Knesset, Ofer Kasif, this is the exact report, the Yeshdin report, which he referred to. So we see here 81% of cases closed, so on and so forth. He already mentioned these numbers. The real question is, how do we stack up against other countries, other democratic countries, in their response to ideologically motivated crime, which is a problem all around the world? And most of my research focuses on these countries and not on Israel. And so I put together a little chart. I could put together more statistics to whoever's interested in this. But we see that the Israeli response, even these low numbers of only 3% convictions, are well within the average and better than many countries, including the United Kingdom, who has applied sanctions on settlers for settler violence. Now, if we actually reduce the number of events to the real number of events, instead of using the number of events reported here by Yeshdin, which are only reports, by the way, in Ireland, 45% of reports are closed because they find that no base crime has occurred. I assume that that's probably a pretty good base rate for most countries, close to 50%. Recently, I heard that the Israeli police claimed that about 50% of cases are closed because they couldn't identify a base crime. In order for it to be an ideologically motivated crime, you first need to have a crime. So in that case, our numbers would go up quite a bit, maybe into the level of New York City, who are actually, surprisingly enough, the best in the world at dealing with ideologically motivated crime. So if we just quickly go to the next and last slide, we can take away from this 4 things that we're dealing here. The sanctions have, the whole idea of the sanctions are based on this misrepresentation and overrepresentation of the issue of settler violence. The numbers are much lower than claimed. Again, I'm using their numbers. I'm not using numbers produced by the Israeli police or the army, for example. The sanctions are antithetical to Western CVE approaches, and I don't understand how they don't see this. I've reached out to colleagues at the Department of Homeland Security, at Europol. Some of them agree with me in private, but they say that there's not really anything that they can do about it. The sanctions are actually having a backlash effect. They say they want to make things better because we're not doing enough. Well, they're actually making things worse. And in this regard, it's not that we weren't doing anything. What we were doing was more than adequate, more in line with what other countries are doing, and I'll leave you with that for now.
תודה.